All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Lauren Davies. I'm the Assistant Director of Alumni Chapters and Networks at the UConn Foundation. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know that there will be a short Q&A at the end of this session, so feel free to post your questions in the chat and the Q&A below. We might not get through them all, but we'll get through as many as we can. And with that, I would like to welcome back our speaker, Mira Dessy. For those that are just joining us for the first time today, Mira, also known as the Ingredient Guru, is an author, speaker, and holistic nutritionist and real food advocate. She emphasizes the importance of healthy lifestyle through whole foods. Welcome, Mira, and everyone enjoy.
Thanks for having me here, Lauren. It's great to be back and to share again. Last week, we talked about Nutrition Label 101, how to read the label. Today, we are talking about what is lurking in your pantry. So I'm going to start the recording. And one of the things to remember is part of the reason we really want to read the label, not just the nutrition panel, but the ingredients, is because there can be ingredients in your food that are harmful for your health. So this is just a little bit about me. As Lauren said, I'm Mira Dessy. I am known as the Ingredient Guru. I have a nerdly fascination with all the stupid stuff they do to our food, but more importantly, helping people understand that so that they can avoid those, what I consider negative ingredients, and choose more nourishing foods and ingredients for their body. I'm also the author of the book, The Pantry Principle, How to Read the Label and Understand What's Really in Your Food. So one of the most important things to remember when it comes to choosing foods to build a diet is that it's not just what you eat, it's what's in what you eat. All of the modifications and adulterations and processing things that they do to our food, all of those ingredients can have an impact on our health. And if we don't look at what we're actually eating, we think that just because it's a top level insert a product here, that's what we're getting. We're not recognizing that there are things that we're putting in our body that provide no nutritional value. Our body has to process them somehow, and sometimes they can actually interfere with bodily function. So today we are going to talk about my top 10 ingredients to avoid. We're going to go through each of these ingredients one at a time. I'm going to share a little bit of the science behind why these don't represent good choices, and then share some other snippets depending on what it is that we're talking about. And then at the end of the session today, several people did send in food labels. Yay, I love that. We're going to go through those labels and I will break them down for you. So the first thing that we really want to look for is artificial colors. And this is one of the things that we also talked about in the 7 simple rules for healthy grocery shopping last week. This is easy to avoid in the US because we are legally mandated to put the name of the color and then what number it is. These are chemical lakes and dyes, and food producers use them in order to give food a consistent color. Part of the reason they do that is because we're biologically programmed to seek out color. We think color represents ripe food, so it looks good, it looks attractive to us. The problem is petrochemicals are really not a good choice for us. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that we know from studies that have been done is that artificial colors can increase hyperactivity and attention-related disorders in children specifically. That's what this one particular study from the Lancet alluded to. But this is something that we've known for a very long time. Dr. Benjamin Feingold was a pediatric allergist with Kaiser in California back in the 60s, and he discovered it back then. Unfortunately, here we are all these years later. We still have artificial colors. It still has an impact. And the only way to avoid it is to read the label and get rid of it. Fortunately, a lot of companies are starting to use things like turmeric, beet juice, spinach powder, other choices that are not chemicals, but you do want to avoid them, not just in your food, also in your personal care product. For example, if your toothpaste has red or blue, you are brushing your teeth with that, It's getting into that soft tissue, into your system, you're swallowing it, so it still has an impact. So we do want to avoid all artificial colors. And there we go. The next thing that we want to watch out for is artificial sweeteners. And one of the biggest challenges that we have with artificial sweeteners is that they have become ubiquitous across the food supply. We see a lot of things that on the front will say that it has, no added sugar. Well, it's no added sugar because they've added an artificial sweetener. One of the other reasons that we're so attracted to artificial sweeteners is we have this negative thinking that says that if we're not consuming sugar, then we won't get fat. We want to have our sugar, we want to have that sweet flavor, but we don't want to gain weight. And that's kind of what led to the artificial sweetener industry. Unfortunately, there are studies that now show that consuming artificial sweeteners can increase the risk for diabetes. There was also another study that showed that there was an increased risk of weight gain because, believe it or not, our brain has a little calculator up there that kind of keeps track of what we're eating. And if we consume a lot of artificial sweetener, we can potentially then go, I didn't get those calories. Where is that? And then we have this increased need for calorie seeking because we're trying to make up what our brain perceives as a deficit. So that's really not great. One of the other things that can happen is artificial sweeteners, by their very nature, in terms of how they function in the body, can impact our gut health. They overwhelm the gut microbiota and change them. And that in turn can lead to other gut health issues, which then increase the risk for potential weight gain, obesity, type 2 diabetes. Now, along with artificial sweeteners, I do lump in the sugar alcohols as well. The way to remember what's a sugar alcohol for the most part is because it ends in OL, sorbitol, that kind of thing, erythritol. Those are sugar alcohols, xylitol. And sugar alcohols are lower in sugar than actual sugar, glucose, fructose, sucrose, those kinds of things. However, sugar alcohols have a very negative impact on the gut because if you consume too much of them, they can have a laxative effect, as well as also potentially modifying gut biota and that sort of thing. So we do want to include those in this artificial sweetener category. I'm not necessarily opposed to certain sweeteners. For example, organic xylitol or organic erythritol can be reasonable. Stevia can be reasonable in moderation rather. Same thing with monk fruit. Those are lower sugar alternatives, but you still don't want to consume a lot of them. They do still have an impact. More importantly would be to learn how to reset your sugar palate so that you're not consuming as much sugar or you don't have as much of a need for sweet. One of the other items that we talked about last week was BHA, and I talked about how in the ingredient panel, sometimes in the cereal aisle, I'm now seeing down below the ingredient panel something that says BHA added to the package for freshness. And so I just want to reiterate, if it's in the packaging, that's just as important as if it's added to the food, because if it's touching the food, it's still getting into the food. Unfortunately, both BHA and BHT have been shown to potentially be carcinogenic. BHA was first listed in 1991 as a reasonably anticipated human carcinogen. And then BHT is still on the cautionary list as a possible carcinogen. One of the things to remember is when we're doing our grocery shopping and we're reading the label, we're reading the ingredient panel, and we're looking at these ingredients, the object is to put it back and find something that doesn't have that. So I want to reiterate, this is not meant to turn into a 5-hour, 6-hour trip to the grocery store trying to replace everything. pick one thing that you're going to work on. So out of the 10 ingredients that we're going to cover today, if you're going to remove one of them from your diet, pick which one most interests you to start with for various different reasons, whatever makes sense to you. Read labels to get rid of that and find alternatives for that. Once you've mastered that and you've shifted your grocery purchases so that you're no longer including that ingredient, then go back and pick another one. This is not meant to be a race to the finish. This is a life-changing habit that will have a benefit for you and for your family members, because a little bit at a time, you're changing your diet, changing how you eat, and including more real food, whole foods into your diet. One of the other things that's on this list is brominated vegetable oil. This is sometimes abbreviated as BVO on the label. It's used as an emulsifier, and part of the reason that they use it is when they have, specifically with citrus flavored things, they have those oils, they need to make sure that it's evenly distributed within the item. And so they use BVO to help it be emulsified and all stay together. As you can see, it was first developed as a flame retardant, so that's kind of icky to think that we would be drinking flame retardant. One of the big challenges is that BVO is not something that our body can get rid of very easily. It does tend to accumulate in the body, and that accumulation can cause a number of different issues. One of the things that happens sometimes with food manufacturers when they're brought to task for some of the things that they're doing, they'll do something called greenwashing or health washing. They make a change and they give themselves like a big yay, attaboy, pat themselves on the back. So this happened with BVO. The manufacturer of Gatorade said so there was a 17-year-old kid who said, we should not be drinking brominated vegetable oil. It's really bad for us. She wrote to the company. She did this whole big social media campaign, got their attention. They removed brominated vegetable oil from Gatorade. And so they gave themselves this big, push, this whole press release thing. Hey, we've removed it. Look at how responsive we are to people who are in our consumer group, blah, 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 yay for us. Well, unfortunately, what they were not letting people know is that they were still using it in other products like Mountain Dew and other sodas like that. So just because they're removing it from one thing doesn't mean they're removing it from everything. And I will share that I tend to be just a little suspicious when they give themselves these big aha press release moments. I am all in favor of removing this. I think they get kudos for doing that. My challenge is when they do it in a way that I find to be deceptive, because they're not making a change across their entire product group. They're just changing the one thing that they've been brought to task for, or making sure that they're directing the attention where they want it to go and sort of ignoring the other stuff off to the side. High fructose corn syrup. This one actually is very interesting because this has been going on for a very, very long time. I don't know how many of you remember the commercials that used to be out a long time ago. And basically it's two people in a park and someone says, hey, you want a popsicle? And the other person goes, oh no, thank you. It has high fructose corn syrup. And the first person goes, really? And what's wrong with high fructose corn syrup? And the second person goes, like they don't know. And so it makes them supposedly look stupid. And the reason for that was because a lot of people started pushing against high fructose corn syrup, saying that it was really bad for us. Metabolically, it was not a good choice as a sweetener. High fructose corn syrup is 55% fructose by volume. And unfortunately, the only organ in our body that can process fructose is our liver. If we overconsume fructose, one of the things that happens is our body begins to save it for later. It does that by putting it into adipose or fatty tissue. And it also causes inflammation of the liver because the liver is working so hard to process this. There are, for example, scientific studies that show that excess fructose consumption is linked to something called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. in very simplistic terms, it's kind of like cirrhosis of the liver for people who don't drink alcohol. Your liver is just being overtasked. It's really, really bad for you. So fast forward a little bit, and the Sugar Refiners Association realized that they weren't going to win the let's make them think they look stupid so they won't want high fructose corn syrup. So then they tried another tack, and they decided they were going to change the name, and they wanted to call it corn sugar. And part of the reason they wanted to change the name is they thought that that would be a good misdirection. Fortunately for the consumers, the FDA disagreed with them, told them they were not allowed to change the name. And so at that point, they began to subside on some of their negative advertising to push back. But interestingly enough, because consumers made a choice and because they clearly stated that they didn't want high fructose corn syrup in their foods, you now see all kinds of things at the grocery store that say no HFCS on the front of the label in big letters, because they know that they don't want or that their consumer group does not want high fructose corn syrup. It does not mean you will not find it at the grocery store. High fructose corn syrup is still very much in our food supply because there's a lot of corn out there, and this is a great cheap way to use it to turn it into a sweetener. Now, along with high fructose corn syrup, there are two other high fructose sweeteners that we need to talk about that also need to come out of the food supply, or at least out of your pantry. One of them is agave nectar. And agave nectar is very popular, especially right now, because it is a low glycemic sweetener, meaning when you consume agave nectar, it does not hit the bloodstream very quickly. And so the body is able to process it a little bit more slowly without having the blood sugar roller coaster that happens when you can normally consume a lot of sugar. So part of the challenge is agave nectar, the way it's made now, is not the same as how the indigenous people used to make it. They used to take agave and they would process it, they would get a sweetener out of it. We're chemically processing it, and we are creating a product that is approximately 70% fructose by volume. So high fructose corn syrup, 55% fructose by volume. Agave nectar is 70% fructose by volume. So as you can see, it's really not a great choice. And it, like I said, it's very popular. A lot of recipes use it. A lot of restaurants use it because it's low glycemic and it's got this halo of being healthy. But from a fructose standpoint, it's not a great choice. And then unfortunately, there is one more high fructose item that we want to remove from the pantry. And that is something called crystalline fructose. And I'm going to admit the name kind of pisses me off because it's a very simple sounding name. Crystalline, crystals, okay, fructose, fruit sugar, sure, that sounds good. Okay. Well, it's not quite that simple. In very, very, very basic terms, crystalline fructose is dehydrated high fructose corn syrup and is 90% fructose by volume. So it is extraordinarily high. It tends to be found, and it's coming out of some of the beverages. It was found more readily in some of the vitamin water, power drinks, those kinds of things. That was the form of sweetener that they were using. As people are pushing back, they're not using it so much. It does still tend to be found quite readily in those self-serve yogurt places, Tutti Frutti, Orange Leaf, some of those places where you go in, you serve yourself yogurt and then you go up to the candy bar and top it up. They don't tell you, it's not right on the machine what's in there. You can ask and they will bring out this big book and flip through and find the yogurt flavor that you're buying and tell you what's in it. But most people don't realize that's crystalline fructose. And again, not a great choice. So at this point, I also want to step aside and say, fructose itself is not necessarily bad for you when it comes bound in its natural form. So if we eat an apple or we have a pear or we have some berries, yes, we are getting fructose. However, it tends to come with fiber, which slows down how quickly our body can absorb it and utilize it. We're meant to work for our sugar. We're not meant to just consume it wholesale the way we can with some of these liquid sweeteners. And so fruit in the diet is a very healthy thing. It's a great choice. It's these artificial liquid sweeteners that are concentrated forms of fructose that are not great for us. So again, just to reiterate, high fructose corn syrup, 55% fructose by volume, agave nectar, 70% fructose by volume, crystalline fructose, 90%. So we do definitely want to avoid these in the diet. Hydrogenated oils. So this one is really kind of fascinating. For the longest time, we've had hydrogenated oils because they allow food producers to take oils that might otherwise be liquid and turn them into a solid at room temperature. So that pretty much is where margarine comes from. And they do that by adding hydrogen to it. Now, one of the challenges is that it turns out hydrogenated oils, hydrogenated and partially hydrogenated, can have cardiovascular health issues. And last week we talked about how they can mislead you on the label as to whether or not there are hydrogenated oils in your food. The biggest challenge right now is that we've had them in the food supply for a very long time. Food producers are very used to using hydrogenated oils in their manufacturing process. Back in November of 2013, so almost 10 years ago, we're getting close, it was removed from the generally recognized as safe list. So it's no longer considered generally recognized as safe. And I'll talk about what that term means in just a minute. However, this is the most important distinction. Even though it was removed from the GRAS list, it was not banned completely in foods. And that's why it's still in there. When you're looking at an ingredient panel, you do need to take the time to look at the bottom and look for those words hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated. If it has that, you do not want to consume it. So we're going to step aside for just a second and talk about generally recognized as safe. Generally recognized as safe is something that the federal government created to allow food producers to come up with new formulations and new ways to utilize things in the food supply. But the FDA can't test everything. So how it works is a food producer comes up with a novel way to use an ingredient, or comes up with a new ingredient, or comes up with a new process for using an ingredient. And they submit it to the FDA and they say, we have hired experts who say that this is safe. And the FDA says, okay. Or they say it has to have a color warning on the label, depending on what it is, how it's being used. Or sometimes what happens is the food producers realize it's possibly not going to pass muster. And so they remove it from, they withdraw it from FDA approval process. The one thing I really want to point out to you is this is the food producers hiring experts to say that their product is safe. It's not something that's totally overseen by the government. They don't have the time or the manpower or the resources to be able to test every single product. And so products sometimes can wind up in the food supply for a very long time, for years or decades, until somewhere along the line, somebody recognizes that it's not good. And this is part of why I encourage people to read the label. I really want you to take the time to build that habit and try to remove as many things that are not really food from your diet as you possibly can. And that really is the best way to make sure that you're nourishing yourself and those you love, and not relying on waiting for the news or the science to catch up with whatever the newest, latest, and greatest ingredient to be added to our food supply really is. Monosodium glutamate. This one is one that has had a lot of attention over the years. They used to talk about Chinese restaurant syndrome. People would get migraines or they would have insomnia after eating MSG. It's present in the food supply, funny enough, not so much in Chinese food anymore. One of the problems is there are a lot of different toxic issues tied to monosodium glutamate. It's sometimes referred to as an excitotoxin. It overstimulates the brain and then can have downstream impact on the rest of our body. One of the challenges that we have with monosodium glutamate is that MSG itself, monosodium glutamate, is a free glutamic acid, and it can definitely overwhelm the system. There are other foods, other additives that can be an equivalent to MSG in terms of how they impact the body. And so when you see the words autolyzed or hydrolyzed, those kinds of things, and those would fall under the seven simple rules that we talked about last week. So I'm not going to go into it today, but those things are other ways to identify other things that are also free glutamic acid. But this is one that's really tricky to avoid in the food system because there are a number of different formulations for ingredients that actually open up glutamates and make them highly accessible to the system. And then, of course, like I said, we can have all of these downstream toxic impacts. Sodium benzoate. This is an ingredient that's used as a preservative. It is known to be a genotoxic. It modifies DNA. And unfortunately, because it's such a useful preservative, it's still in the food supply. It falls under that GRAS rule that I was talking about. They're saying if you just have this much, so many parts per million, it's okay, it won't hurt you. My issue with that is who's keeping track of how much you're eating? If you're not reading the label, if you don't know exactly how much is in there and they don't tell you how much is in there, so how could you know? It's very difficult to know when you hit that dose that puts you over so many parts per million. And if you eat a little bit every day, it does have a cumulative impact. One of the big challenges with sodium benzoate, and the reason I encourage people to remove it from their diet, from all aspects of the diet, and I'm talking supplements, personal care products, and food, is because when combined with vitamin C and E, it can form something known as benzene, and benzene is a known carcinogen. So we do not want anything that can potentially cause that or impact our system that way. And then we have sodium nitrate or nitrites. So these are usually found in processed meats. They're mostly found in things like bacon, sausages, lunch meat, that kind of thing. They can cause cancer in the digestive tract. And one of the other things that's really challenging is that when they're cooked, which you would do with things like bacon and sausages, you can get something known as nitrosamine, which is a known carcinogen. Now, in this case, I'm talking specifically about sodium nitrate, sodium nitrite. These are chemical formulations. There are naturally occurring nitrates that happen in our food. For example, sometimes you may see a lunch meat package and it says celery juice added as a preservative. Well, celery actually has a little bit of naturally forming nitrate in it. Not bad, not harmful, unless you're one of those people who happens to be sensitive to it. But we do want to avoid the laboratory created versions, as those are the ones that are most likely to be harmful. Soy, corn, canola, and I'm talking non-organic here. This is where we are looking at the issue with genetic modification. So these three crops currently tend to be the most highly genetically modified crops that we have. The reason they're genetically modified is so that they can be field sprayed very heavily to help reduce weeds, and that they resist the ingredients in there, most notably glyphosate. And one of the biggest objections to genetic modification and the fact that these crops are so heavily sprayed with glyphosate is that glyphosate is a chelating agent. And what that means is it binds with minerals in the soil. So that means it's not allowing those minerals, things like calcium and iron, to be taken up from the soil into the plant. And if the plant doesn't have it, then when you eat that plant, it doesn't have it. The other challenge is when these crops are so heavily sprayed with glyphosate, it gets into the plant. It's not just on top of it because it's in the soil, they're taking it up. And then the crops that we're eating are heavily laden with glyphosate. And glyphosate can cause intestinal health issues, gut health issues. There are actually tests out now that you can order from a doctor's office. I think there's one you might even be able to order online that shows if you have glyphosate toxicity, meaning you're over consuming glyphosate. And that lets you know that it's accumulating in your system and it's not something that you really want to deal with. So I do encourage, if you're going to eat any of these products, that you purchase them organic only in order to avoid the use of glyphosate. So this is the top 10 list of ingredients that we want to avoid. And I want to point out, not one of these things is real food. They're found in food or food-like products, but they themselves are not individually anything that has any nourishing value for you. Yes, the corn, soy, and canola are actually real food, but when they're non-organic, they come with an added ingredient that's not a great choice. And so these are the ones that we want to read the label. We want to make sure that we are avoiding them in everything that we bring into our home. And I want to reiterate, this is not meant to be overwhelming. This is not meant to be something that is so frustrating that you don't do it. We start one step at a time. And then as we've gotten rid of one thing, we come back and we do the next thing. Over time, I promise you, you will clean up your pantry and you'll be so amazed at what's not in there anymore. Now, one of the things that we did ask for, once again, is for people to send labels, and they did, which is so great. So I am going to start going through a few labels with you, and then we'll have time for Q&A. I do want to give you a little bit of a disclaimer before I dive into these labels. One is, this is me being ultimately picky as possible, to just help you understand what we're looking at when we look at these different labels that people have shared with me. When I'm working with clients, I generally go for what I call my good, better, best scale. And so some of these are things that they might be reasonable to consume, but I'm breaking it down just so that you can understand what we're looking at. I hope that's clear. All right. So the first thing we have is almond milk. Almond milk is very popular these days. A lot of people are switching away from cow's milk dairy, and there are a lot of options: almond, coconut, oat, cashew, hazelnut, different kinds of things. When we look at the ingredient panel here, and it didn't blow up very well, but that's okay. One of the things that I did want to point out to you, and I think this is in every single thing that we have just about in today's labels, is my favorite, unfavorite natural flavor. We don't really know what that is. They're allowed to include the term natural flavor to not have to tell us what they use to flavor it with. And really, it can be a lot of things. It can be a distillate. It can be a chemical concoction. It can be something that is infused in some way through a chemical substrate. Like, there's lots of different things that they can do to create a natural flavor. I try to avoid them as much as possible. It is really, really difficult. I'm just going to say that up front. So to be aware of the fact that if there's an option to avoid, that is a good one to try to avoid natural flavors. Now, one of the other things that we have in here, this particular formulation has gellan gum, and gellan gum is a plant-based food gum. They're using it because almond milk by itself is not that thick. It's very thin, actually, and they want to give just a little bit more thickness to it so that it feels better in our mouth. It's not, these plant-based gums, gellan gum, acacia gum, locust bean gum, they're not necessarily bad in and of themselves. The challenge is to be aware of the fact that if you're consuming a lot of plant-based gums, it can have an impact on your gut. The way these plant gums work is, once you consume them, the body pulls liquid into the gut to help with processing these gums. And so you can have either diarrhea or constipation, possibly bloating. And so if you're someone who has a little bit of low-level gut health issue, you may want to look at how many plant gums you're consuming And one of the other things that I like to encourage people to do, if you have the time, there are actually two options to use or to consider instead of purchasing almond milk at the grocery store. One is to actually make it yourself. It is very easy. You soak some almonds and then drain them, add water, blend them, strain them, and it's good to go. Or the other thing is there is a company called Add Joy, J-O-I, and they have an almond milk paste, if you will. It comes in a bucket. 1 tablespoon plus 1 cup of water makes 1 cup of almond milk. It is a single ingredient product. So that's definitely a potential option for those who want that. The next thing that we have is this sparkling kiwi guava water. And I love this one, it's so great. So there's a couple of things that I wanted to point out. One is that the front of package labeling here, very, very clever. So they have like the bubbles to make you think, oh, you know, it's the sparkling water, it's great, isn't that fabulous? And then they have some great keywords here talking about, you know, essential energy, accelerates metabolism, burns body fat. This is what's called front of package labeling. They also have up here, I believe it says 0 grams of sugar and no preservatives. This is them trying to convince you that you do not need to flip this container around in order to read the back, because they've already told you everything you need to know right on the front. But when we do flip it around, we discover a couple of things. One is that citric acid is an ingredient that typically tends to be made from corn. Because it is not organic citric acid, chances are it's genetically modified, which means you're getting some glyphosate exposure there. It does have that natural flavor. Once again, it's crazy how often that appears at the grocery store. I've once thought that it'd be really interesting to just go through every aisle of the grocery store and see how many things had natural flavor in them. It's a lot. And then the other thing is it says 0 sugar up here, because down here it's using sucralose, in other words, Splenda, which is an artificial sweetener, not a great choice. There is a story that and I've researched it, it's been repeated a lot. I have not been able to ever find the origin source, but I do know that Splenda, sucralose, was originally created to be an insecticide. What they did is they thought if they took sugar and they hyperchlorinated it, that would open up the sugar molecules. It would make it very attractive to insects who would eat it, and it would kill them. And so here's the story part that I haven't ever been able to find the origin source for. Supposedly in a lab, they were testing it, and the lead researcher told all of the research assistants to test it. One of them was not a native English speaker. He thought they said taste it. And so when they got back for their weekly meeting, he said tastes sweet. And everybody looked at him and wanted to know why he was okay. And they discovered that bugs won't eat it and it does taste sweet. And they had just discovered a new artificial sweetener. In any event, sucralose, Splenda, still an artificial sweetener, not something I recommend. So this next one is Dave's bread, organic sprouted whole grain bread. And this is one of those things that if you are someone who loves bread and eats grains, especially gluten grains, this is actually not a bad choice. It does have a number of different grains in here. They're all listed up at the top here, the grain mix. They're organic, which is good. It is organic expeller pressed canola oil. So we know that that canola oil is not being exposed to the glyphosate because it's organic. So that's on the label. There's nothing enriched in here, which we had talked about last week as being one of the things to avoid. And then we do have, vinegar, more wheat flour, and then the cherry powder and some enzymes. So if you're someone who eats bread, I would say this is actually a reasonable choice. So whoever shared this, yay for you. And then the last one that we have before we start with questions and answers is, I believe this is a yogurt product. And I'm guessing that in part because it's produced by Dannon, and it has milk in it. So there's a couple of things. Once again, natural flavor. There we go. I am not a fan of consuming reduced fat milk products. If you're going to consume dairy, it really is best to consume full fat. There's a couple different reasons for that. One is that dairy product is one of our few food-based sources of vitamin D. Vitamin D happens to be a fat-soluble vitamin. So if we're not consuming enough fat to go along with it, our body is not properly activating the fat-soluble vitamins. Those are A, D, E, and K. And the other thing is, when we have full fat product, we do not need to add things like gellan gum and tapioca starch because it's thicker all by itself. So it's going to have a better mouthfeel. It's going to be more satisfying. Studies have shown that when we have good mouthfeel and it's very satisfying, we actually eat less because we do respond to how our food feels in our mouth as well as how it tastes and smells. One of the other things that I wanted to share is that right here they had turmeric and fruit and vegetable juice concentrate for color. So that is a wonderful option for color instead of the artificial colors that they might have used. So that's just the breakdown of that. And I'm going to share. So the last thing that I just wanted to share is, once again, this is me. I'm Mira Dessy. I am the ingredient guru, and I love helping answer food-based questions for people. So now I'm going to stop sharing the slides and come back to the presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you folks have.
Thanks, Mira. So we have a few questions that came in. So we'll start with first one being a few people were interested in if they can receive this PowerPoint, or specifically kind of like a top hits of those 10 ingredients to avoid.
Well, so I know you're going to be sharing this, and so they would certainly be able to get it that way. The other way to find out all of that would be to purchase a copy of my book, The Pantry Principle: How to Read the Label and Understand What's Really in Your Food.
All right. Our next one, are there any good replacements for agave in healthy recipes? Would you prefer honey or maple syrup better?
I do. I prefer honey or maple syrup. Date syrup is another one that's very good also, but those would be the best options.
Can you speak a little bit about using canola oil in cooking?
Oh yeah, great question. I'm not a fan. Canola oil, first of all, is hard to find organic canola oil. But the other thing is, it's a vegetable-based oil that is not going to represent the best choice for cooking. If you're looking for vegetable oil, I am very much in favor of olive oil or avocado oil for cooking. Part of the challenge with canola when it's genetically modified, obviously we've talked about the glyphosate, but also those vegetable-based oils tend to be higher in omega-6s. We need both omega-6 and omega-3 in the diet, but 6s are more inflammatory. And so if we're cooking in them, we're just adding a lot of inflammatory load to our diet.
Thanks. Are you able to suggest any healthy brands of yogurt that you like?
Oh, that's really hard. I talked about this last week. I am a big fan of being what I call brand disloyal. You really have to look at the labels and find one that works for you. Or the other thing, like for all those Instant Pot fans out there, the Instant Pot, you can actually make your own yogurt in an Instant Pot, and it's so easy. It has a yogurt setting. So that could be a really great way to do it.
Awesome. Can you talk a little bit about kombucha? Are you a fan of kombucha? Is it a good healthy alternative to say maybe alcoholic beverages and stuff like that?
Yes, I love kombucha. So as long as your system can tolerate it, there are some people who can't handle quite that much fermentation if they've got some gut health issues going on. But for those who can, which is a lot of people, most of us, I believe, kombucha is great. It's a lacto-fermented beverage. And so it adds beneficial bacteria to the system. It's also something that is kind of like a nourishing food because of how it stimulates the system. It starts with a SCOBY, that's a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast, and those are then added in when we consume it. Other fermented foods that are good choices would also include things like kefir, Kefir, which comes both in a water version or a dairy version. There's also something called kvass, which is made from lacto-fermented beets. So those are all good beverage choices that have that nice ferment.
Great. Our next question is here. Do you recommend taking probiotics? And if so, do you have any brand suggestions or what to look for in them?
Sure. So I do recommend taking probiotics, not on an everyday basis, but if you've had to, let's say you've had to take an antibiotic, I generally suggest taking probiotics. You have to take them 2 hours apart with the antibiotics because antibiotics kill everything, good and bad. And then to continue to take the probiotic for 14 days past the last dose of antibiotic. If you have some other things going on, gut sufficiency is low or whatever, taking a 30-day round of probiotics can definitely be helpful. For people who have a lot of gut health issues, constipation, that kind of thing, adding enzymes and probiotics together can also be really good for that. I do actually have a favorite brand. It's called Transformation Enzymes, Transformation Enzyme Corporation, and their probiotic and enzyme products have absolutely no fillers in them. And as a matter of fact, I actually know them personally. I will call them and tell them, I'm going to get in trouble for this, but that's okay. I'm writing this down. Yukon free shipping. They're right here in my hometown in Houston. So I'm going to call them and I'm going to tell them if anybody from this call calls them and says, hey, I saw Mira's Yukon call and she said I could have free shipping. You can have free shipping. I'll make it happen.
Great. Wow. All right. So we have another question here as well. Should the sulfites in vinegar be avoided?
Only if you're sensitive to sulfites.
All right. And then another question here. Can you comment a little bit more on the monk fruit sweetener?
On the what? Oh, monk fruit sweetener. Sure. So monk fruit sweetener, Lohan Guo, was discovered and brought over to this. We import a lot of our food from other places. Quinoa, for example, originally came from Peru, and we've just developed a love affair with it in this country because it's a protein-containing grain, pseudo grain. So monk fruit is a natural sweetener, and it comes from Asia. It can be a good way to add a little bit of sweetness to something without a lot of sugar. The challenge is for some people, just like with anything, we are all bio-individual. There is no one food that fits every single person on the face of the planet. Different people have different sensitivities at different times. And some people are a little bit more sensitive to monk fruit, or they can only handle a certain amount of it. Same thing with stevia. There are some people who don't like stevia because it's got this aftertaste to them. They're super tasters. Their genetics make it difficult for them. Or if they consume too much stevia, they don't feel good. So you have to look at being really mindful of what's going on with your body when you consume these. How do you feel and where's your level? I still am going to recommend that we consume it in moderation, not, to not consume it to excess simply because it's a low, a low calorie sweetener.
Great. Next question. Do you have a good vitamin D supplement to recommend and what to look for in those kinds of supplements?
Great question. So with vitamin D, I will share that the one that I take personally is from a company called Perk, Perque. It's more, rather than looking for a specific supplement or a specific level, it's really important to be working with someone to know how much you need, because different people need different amounts of vitamin D depending on what's going on with their health or whatever. So I can't recommend a specific formulation or a specific amount.
Great. So another question we have is, does going to natural grocery stores or ones that we consider to be seen as healthier, such as like Trader Joe's or Aldi, do they use less of these ingredients, these top 10 ingredients that you were talking about in their food products? Can people rely on going to, say, a natural grocery store for more natural foods, or should we still heavily be paying attention to those labels?
That is such a great question. So Trader Joe's is very much known for, first of all, I don't think they make very much themselves. They white label just about everything. And they push back against any kind of labeling. They use a lot of canola in their stuff. And it's not that, there are still good things that you can buy there. Same thing for Aldi, which by the way is owned by, Trader Joe's is owned by Aldi, yes. Anyhow, the biggest thing to remember, again, I can't encourage you enough. Read the label and be brand disloyal. You really need to be able to focus on what's working for you inside of a store than simply assuming that just because it's a Whole Foods or a Natural Grocers or a Sprouts or whatever, that everything that's in there is safe. I have never found a grocery store that had 100% products that had nothing that was not somehow, that didn't come out right. I have never been in a grocery store that did not have no products whatsoever that had no negative ingredients. So you still have to read the label, I'm sorry.
Thanks. That's a great reminder. I think we very often get caught up on having, associations with stores that we think are healthier and, kind of just go off of that. So that's a great reminder.
Well, and can I, if I can interject, I'd also like to point out one of the other things to keep in mind is this really ties back into the issue of who owns your food. It's really, really crazy, the web of food ownership that happens in this country. And it used to be that when a company bought another company, they changed the name. They don't do that anymore because they've learned they're not just buying the company, they're buying their consumer base. And so they purchase this product and this product line, and they keep it the same because they're expecting that the consumers are going to stay there forever. The example that I use sometimes is Ben & Jerry's. Ben & Jerry's used to be a much cleaner ice cream company. Then they got bought by Unilever, and Unilever said to Ben & Jerry, "We love you guys, yay, like stay on for a few years and help us make this transition." They did. And then at the end of the 3 years, Lever was like, bye-bye. And they sent them out the door. And then the products started to change. And now there's things in Ben & Jerry's that never used to be in there because it's more expedient for the company. So when a food brand changes, the potential is at some point down the road, their product is going to change as well. And this is why you still, and I don't obsessively read like every single label that I purchase, but I do flip them over and look at them before they go in my pantry because I know things change.
All right, so next question here is, do you have any suggestions of what ingredients to look for, or more importantly, avoid for people with autoimmune issues?
Oh, yeah. And, the ones that we talked about, plus the 7 simple rules from last week, is a great start. And then above and beyond that, I would strongly recommend working with a nutrition professional who specializes in autoimmune disorders, who can help you navigate what's going to work for you. There are, autoimmune is a spectrum of disorders. And so having someone who can help you hone in on what's going on with your body and what the needs of your specific situation are is really important. That's sadly not something I can just answer off the cuff.
Great. So next one here is opinions on chocolate. Are there healthy options to consuming chocolate?
I love chocolate. So, I think with chocolate, one of the things to keep in mind is we still want to read the label. Obviously, we want it to be as clean as possible. Dark chocolate is better for you. The antioxidants and polyphenols that are in dark chocolate are very healthy. If you're going to eat a lower cacao, let's say, for example, you're going to choose a 50% instead of an 80%, it's more about reading the label, and it's also something to eat in moderation. I will share a tip on how to get the most out of your chocolate. When we buy chocolate, we tend to break off a piece and we munch because it tastes so good. Well, one way to actually make it taste even better is to break off a little square, put it in your mouth, and then push it up to the roof of your mouth, hold it there with your tongue, and just, I'm starting to salivate just thinking about it, and just let it melt. And as you do that, you'll actually get more flavor and more enjoyment out of the chocolate than if you munched it down. And chances are you'll only eat 1 or 2 squares that way instead of half a bar.
Great. Along those lines, are there any healthy ice cream brands that you can suggest? And to follow up with that as well, how do you feel about all of the higher protein, low sugar ice creams that are coming out?
So, unfortunately, I'm feeling like a broken record. I'm sorry. With ice cream, I don't have a particular brand that I can recommend. And part of that is because there are so many different things depending on what people's dietary philosophy or aim is. Are you plant-based? Are you keto? Are you paleo? Are you, whatever? So it's very difficult. There's no one ice cream company that does everything. Just watch out for the bad ingredients. The high protein stuff I will share. I find it, the high protein and the probiotic stuff, I'm having a little bit of a bugaboo with that at the moment, because food producers they love when consumers have trends because they can capitalize on that. They spend, I kid you not, tens of millions of dollars a year doing focus groups and figuring out what the buzzwords are. And when they figure out what those words are, those words all of a sudden appear on the front of a package, or they make them into the formulation. The challenge is, yes, we need protein. Yes, some of us may not be getting enough. But if we start putting too much protein in things, then we could potentially be overwhelming our body because we're consuming more protein and not enough vegetable matter. And it also can have an impact on our ability to detoxify. We can become very acidic, which is not a great body state to be in. Same thing with probiotics. We start having probiotic cereals and probiotic ice creams and probiotic, other foods. Yogurt is probiotic, but other foods, not yogurt, that are highly probiotic. And all of a sudden we're over consuming probiotics, potentially overwhelming the cultures and colonies that are already in our system. And we need to remember to stop and go, is that because we really want it or need it? Or is it because we've been convinced to buy by the food producers?
Great. Thanks so much, Mira. Well, we are out of time, but I want to thank you so much, Mira, for joining us. And I want to thank everyone for joining this webinar as well. Don't forget that we do have new sessions coming up in March. So we will be returning with this Healthy Husky series, but I hope you all enjoyed this session and learned something new. And Mira, we can't thank you enough. In the follow-up email that you will be receiving, you will get the recording of this. We will post Mira's website as well as the title of her book. So you can follow up with that and have a way to contact Mira if you're interested about learning more. All right. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me on. And thanks, folks, for such great questions and sharing labels. It was really wonderful to be able to share with all of you. Appreciate it.
Have a great day, everybody.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye-bye.